4:30 in the morning. You're 14 years old, and instead of sleeping, you're hauling buckets of coal up 3 flights of stairs. Your arms ache, your back burns, and the house is still silent. Upstairs, the family dreams peacefully in feather beds. Down here, you sweat in the dark, a ghost no one notices. And here's the shocking part. Before the sun has even risen, you've already worked harder than most people will in an entire day. 60 boots wait to be polished. Dozens of fires must be coaxed to life before breakfast. And if a single speck of soot clings to the mantelpiece, the mistress's white-gloved finger will find it, and your place in this household may end before nightfall. That is the reality of Victorian service. Invisible, thankless, and always one mistake away from ruin. Before we step into the servants' world tonight, a quick note. If you'd like to listen to these stories without ads, offline, and with a bonus insider episode, you can find the ad-free collection linked in the description and pinned comment. Now, what time is it where you are right now? Are you tucked up in bed, warm, listening? Imagine being awake because your entire job is making sure other people never think about where their heat, water, or comfort comes from. And if you don't subscribe, well, that's fine. Just remember, Victorian servants didn't get recognition either. Their lives vanished without a trace. Maybe you'd like to keep mine from doing the same. So close your eyes. For tonight, you're no longer you. You're a servant in a Victorian household. Welcome to a world of cold, endless work and silence. You open your eyes to darkness, not the soft, cozy kind of darkness you fall asleep to, but the kind that clings like damp cloth. The air is cold enough to bite. Your breath leaves a faint white cloud, the only decoration this attic will ever get. No wallpaper, no carpets, no curtains, just bare boards, beams that creak in the wind, and a low ceiling that ensures you'll hit your head at least once a week. Welcome to the grand luxury of your new home, the servants' dormitory. The straw mattress beneath you feels less like a bed and more like a sack of old potatoes. It itches. It smells faintly of mildew. The blanket is thin enough to be legally considered a suggestion rather than actual bedding. And yes, that lump digging into your spine is exactly what it feels like. A sharp straw stalk. No one here ever thought about comfort. Servants were expected to fall asleep from sheer exhaustion, not from softness. You shift, joints stiff, because even at 14, your body is already starting to complain about the schedule. Knees ache, back sore, hands cracked. There's no fire to chase the chill away. Fires are for the family, not for you. Besides, even if there was one, lighting it would only mean extra soot to scrub later. You glance around. Privacy? Forget it. Dozens of you share this attic, row after row of straw pallets crammed so close together that turning over at night risks elbowing the neighbor in the face. You hear snoring, coughing, someone groaning in their sleep. Someone else mutters a prayer. The communal wash basin sits at the far end. One cracked porcelain bowl, half filled with water gone gray from yesterday's use. You'll splash your face in that later if there's time, and try to ignore the floating debris. Then it comes. The sound that drags you fully into the day. A voice, sharp and relentless, cutting through the gloom. Up, all of you, at once. It's the senior maid, older, tougher, with a tongue like a whip and lungs that could summon the dead. She has the authority of someone who's survived a decade in service without collapsing. And she has no patience for your slowness. So you scramble upright, shivering, fumbling into your coarse cotton shift and apron. Boots, still damp from yesterday's scrubbing, go back on, cold against your feet. Caps and collars must be neat, because heaven help you if you're caught looking less than spotless, even after climbing 3 flights of stairs with coal dust in your hair. By the way, congratulations. You've officially woken up before the roosters. They're still asleep in their coops, blissfully unaware that even poultry enjoy a more leisurely start than you. Lucky birds. Down below, the house still dreams. Lady Charlotte won't stir for hours. Her feather mattress will cradle her in warmth while you break your back, making sure she never notices how hard her life is not. The master, perhaps, is snoring in brandy-scented slumber, his only complaint tomorrow being that the soles of his shoes aren't quite shiny enough. But you're already working. Because here's the secret to Victorian service. The household is alive long before the family wakes. Your first job isn't glamorous. In fact, it isn't even visible. You'll be stoking fires no one will thank you for, hauling coal no one will notice, and fetching water no one will think about. If you do it right, your work disappears. A clean grate, a lit fire, hot water waiting in porcelain jugs. These are never admired, they are simply expected. And that's the real paradox of your new world. You exist so the family can pretend you don't. You'll pass them in corridors, eyes lowered, silent unless spoken to. You'll serve their food, polish their boots, sweep their ashes, and vanish again. The best compliment you'll ever get is the absence of complaint. Still, there's no time to brood in the attic. The voice is barking again. Move! If you're last to the stairs, you'll get the brunt of the day's scolding. You clatter down the narrow servant staircase, steep and twisting, built so you can scurry unseen through the house like a shadow. The boards groan under the weight of dozens of tired feet. Your stomach grumbles, but forget food. Breakfast for servants comes after hours of work, if at all. The corridor at the bottom smells of coal dust and damp stone. Somewhere, the kitchen range coughs as a scullery maid wrestles with it. You'll join her soon enough, but first there are grates to empty. Cold ashes are dumped into pails, soot clings to your sleeves. Every step, every breath is labor, and you remind yourself that this is only the beginning. The real work hasn't even started yet. It would be tempting to think of this as a kind of apprenticeship, a short phase before better things. But in truth, for most servants, this attic will be home for years. Childhood ends quickly here. 14-year-olds wake as adults, expected to carry adult burdens, until their bodies bend permanently under the weight. And yet, you manage. Because you must. The household depends on its invisible army of ghosts in aprons and livery. Without you, the grand machine seizes up. Fires go out, meals are delayed, boots remain dirty. And in Victorian England, that kind of failure is unthinkable. So you keep moving, down the corridor, up the next staircase, into rooms where silence and soot wait for you. The masters above are still dreaming. You've already started living the day that never truly ends. You've made it down from the attic and into the pulse of the house, if pulse is the right word. The truth is, a Victorian household doesn't throb with life the way a body does. It clanks, it grinds, it wheezes. It's less a living organism and more a machine, a vast, complicated, squeaking contraption powered by dozens of human cogs. And congratulations, you are one of them. Replaceable, interchangeable, forgettable. Look around. Each servant here is just another wheel turning endlessly, keeping the family's illusion of effortless grandeur alive. The beauty of the drawing room upstairs, polished silver, gleaming glass, velvet curtains, doesn't exist on its own. It is manufactured every single day by this hidden engine of labor. If even one cog slips, the whole machine falters, and no one wants that, least of all you. At the top of the machine, there are two figures, the butler and the housekeeper. Imagine them as the engineers of this human factory, watching the dials and making sure the belts don't snap. The butler, always male, carries himself with a dignity that's half performance and half survival. He controls the wine cellar, the silver, the male staff, and the dignity of the household. His word below stairs is law, and his silence upstairs is just as powerful. Beside him, the housekeeper, usually a stern woman, gray hair pinned tightly, keys jingling at her waist. Those keys are more than tools. They are symbols. They open storerooms, linen closets, pantries. They lock away sugar and tea. Luxuries far too valuable to be trusted in the hands of junior staff. When she walks, the faint jangle announces her authority, and for many servants, it's the sound of both fear and order. A good housekeeper is said to command obedience with nothing more than the turn of her keys. Below them, the machine splits into its many parts. The valet tends the master's suits and boots, while the lady's maid handles the mistress's gowns, hair, and private comforts. These roles are coveted because they hover close to the family's orbit. They see the secrets, hear the whispers. They also deal with the chamber pots, which is less glamorous, but balance is important. Then come the footmen, dressed in livery, chosen for their height and good looks. They are the ornamental cogs of the household. Their job? To look symmetrical while serving soup, to open doors with the exact degree of flourish, to stand still long enough to resemble furniture, but handsome furniture, entirely decorative, but expensive to maintain. Families love to show off their footmen like a status symbol, as if to say, "Look at us. We are so wealthy. We can afford tall men who do nothing but look nice while holding trays." The maids fill the bulk of the system. Housemaids sweep, dust, polish, and make beds. Parlor maids wait at tables. Nursemaids wrangle the children, who are often louder and messier than their parents. Kitchen maids chop, stir, and sweat in the heat of the range, their hands perpetually raw. And at the bottom rung, scraping grime where no one else dares, is the scullery maid. She lives knee-deep in greasy pans, mountains of plates, and water so cold it cracks her skin open. If you are unlucky, you will start here. At the very bottom, too, is the hall boy, sometimes only 10 or 11 years old. His duties? Emptying chamber pots, cleaning boots, and running errands until his legs collapse. He sleeps in the servants' hall, on a folding bed, so he can be on call at any hour. He is the machine's oil, poured into every crevice, and when he breaks down, he is simply replaced with another boy. Do the masters know his name? Of course not. Do they know your name? Doubtful. Don't worry. If they can't remember, they'll just rename you Mary, like the last 3 maids before you. In a house this size, individuality is not encouraged. You are not here to be a person. You are here to be a function. This is the strange paradox of service. Upstairs, the family presents itself as the pinnacle of refinement, order, and civilization. But that illusion only works if an invisible army operates perfectly below stairs. The family doesn't see the ash under your fingernails, the bruises on your shoulders from carrying coal scuttles, or the cracked skin on your hands from endless scrubbing. They see only what the machine produces: gleaming fireplaces, spotless glassware, hot baths, and perfectly ironed linens. And what happens when a cog falters? Well, the machine has no patience. A scullery maid who collapses from exhaustion can be dismissed without notice. A footman who breaks a dish may find himself unemployed by morning. A housemaid who dares answer back risks losing not only her job, but her character, the written reference from her employer that determines whether anyone else will hire her. Without that, she's finished. So you learn quickly. You learn to walk silently through hidden corridors and staircases, moving like a ghost so as not to disturb the family's peace. You learn the unspoken rule. The better you are at your job, the less visible you become. When you succeed, you vanish. When you fail, you are noticed and punished. And what about ambition? Surely with enough work one could climb the machine, from hall boy to footman, footman to valet, perhaps even butler one day. It happens occasionally. A scullery maid might rise to kitchen maid and then cook if she survives long enough. But for most, there is no ladder, only repetition, only exhaustion. You don't rise through the machine, you wear yourself out within it. Still, for all its grinding cruelty, the system has its rhythm. The butler rings a bell, the housekeeper issues orders, the kitchen clatters, the maids sweep and scrub. Each cog turns precisely timed, endlessly repeated. To the family upstairs, it looks effortless. To you, it feels like eternity. And as you glance at the butler and housekeeper, rulers of this subterranean world, you realize something else. Even they are still cogs. Slightly larger, perhaps, polished brass instead of rusted iron, but cogs all the same. The machine consumes everyone, even those who think they control it. So, welcome to your role in the household machine. You may not be admired, remembered, or even called by your real name. But as long as you keep turning, the house will keep running, and the family above will keep pretending it runs itself. The sun still hasn't risen, but you don't need sunlight. You need fire. Lots of it. Because in a Victorian household, warmth doesn't just appear by magic. It has to be coaxed into existence, coal scuttle by coal scuttle, flame by flame, hand by frozen hand. So here you are, bent double in the gray dawn light, lugging a metal bucket of coal that weighs nearly as much as you do. Each step on the narrow stairs sends a jolt through your arms. The scuttle's handle digs into your palm, and the dust clings to your sleeves, your hair, and, inevitably, your lungs. By the time you reach the drawing room, you're already coughing. And your reward? Emptying yesterday's ashes. The fireplace is still warm from the family's late-night brandy and gossip, but it's choked with soot and ash. You kneel, scrape, sweep, and shovel, trying to make the hearth look untouched. The irony is obvious. Your job is literally dusting coal dust while breathing coal dust. One day this will leave your lungs wheezing like a set of broken bellows, but for now, you're too busy to notice. Then comes the ritual of laying the fire. First, the cinders, arranged carefully, like a puzzle. Then sticks, then coal, each piece placed as though you were building a tiny cathedral. One spark, a faint glow, and the fire is alive again. Not for you, of course. This fire is for the family, so they can step into their parlor hours later and pretend the house simply wakes itself. But you're not done. Not by half. There are dozens of fireplaces in this house. Every grate must be cleaned, every fire coaxed back to life. Up and down the corridors you go, shoulders aching, knees black with soot. Each time you set down your scuttle, it feels heavier when you pick it up again. And then there's the water. Hot baths do not flow from taps in this century. They arrive courtesy of your back. Pails of cold water must be hauled from the pump, sometimes outside, sometimes deep in the bowels of the scullery. Each jug must then be lugged upstairs, sloshing with every uneven step. You balance them carefully because spilling even a little could mean a scolding. Then, when the coppers are heated, you fetch the hot water too, endless up and down like a living pump, except you get tired, and pumps don't. Of course, every surface must gleam. Dusting, polishing, wiping. It never ends. The mistress may trail her fingers over the mantelpiece later, clad in immaculate white gloves, just to check your diligence. A single streak of ash, one invisible smear, and you'll hear about it for days. Servants call it the white glove test, though privately you might call it something less polite. There's an absurdity to it, scrubbing and dusting coal dust while more coal dust floats through the air, ensuring your work is undone almost as soon as it's finished. But the household doesn't care. Clean is defined not by reality, but by the appearance of perfection. If the mistress's gloves remain spotless, you've done well. If not, well, perhaps your replacement will. By now you're sweating from the fires and shivering from the drafts. Your stomach rumbles, but breakfast is still hours away. Not your breakfast, mind you. Theirs. When the family finally stirs, their table will already be set with steaming porridge, eggs, toast, and coffee. Yours, when it comes, will be a crust of bread and weak tea, if you're lucky. But you don't have time to think about food yet. There's too much left to do. The clocks must be wound. The silver must be polished until it blinds you. Carpets must be beaten, rugs straightened, boots brushed. And all of it before the first bell rings from above, summoning you for whatever trivial need occurs to the family upon waking. This is the rhythm of service, invisible, exhausting, relentless. You will have put in 4 or 5 hours of labor before the family even yawns, before their slippers touch the carpet, before they stretch luxuriously and wonder aloud whether the weather looks fair for a drive. You are the machinery behind their comfort, and the machinery does not rest. Think of it this way. By 7 o'clock in the morning, you've already done more physical labor than most modern people will do in an entire day. And yet, in the eyes of your employers, you've accomplished nothing, because good service is measured by absence. If the rooms look warm and clean, you are invisible. If anything is out of place, you are the problem. The exhaustion settles in before the day has even begun. Your muscles ache, your lungs sting, your hands are raw. You don't even know if you'll make it to the evening without collapsing. But there is no choice. The machine must keep turning, and you are one of its smallest, most forgettable cogs. So you keep scrubbing, you keep hauling, you keep breathing coal dust while trying not to cough too loudly, lest someone accuse you of slacking. Because in this house, silence is golden, obedience is survival, and exhaustion is the natural state of being. And as you strike the match for yet another fire, watching the flame catch and flare, you realize something grimly funny. The only warmth you'll ever get in this house is the heat you build for someone else. And if you click away without subscribing, well, you'll be treating me the same way the Victorians treated their servants, doing the work, vanishing without recognition. You've scrubbed, you've hauled, you've lit enough fires to rival a small factory furnace, and still the day hasn't properly begun. Because now comes the part every servant dreads, the roll call of orders. The servants' hall fills with bodies, stiff from the morning scramble, boots damp, aprons already smudged with coal dust. You try to stand straight, but your shoulders ache and your stomach twists with hunger. At the head of the table sits the butler, eyes calm, hands folded with the kind of authority that comes from not having carried a single bucket of water this morning. Beside him is the housekeeper, her face unreadable, her ring of keys resting heavily against her waist. The jingle of those keys is enough to silence a room. It's a sound you've learned to fear, though you'd never admit it out loud. That metallic clink means the housekeeper is about to unlock her store of instructions, and none of them will be pleasant. She begins. Her voice is sharp, brisk, practiced. Each maid is assigned a room, each footman a task, each scullery hand another mountain of pots. The lists go on and on, carpets to beat, brass to polish, linen to air, furniture to wax. You're told where to stand, how to walk, when to speak, and when to remain silent, which incidentally is almost always. There's no pretending here that you're anything but the lowest gear in the mechanism. The hierarchy is made painfully clear. The senior housemaid receives her duties with a nod of respect. You, on the other hand, are told what to do in the same tone one might use for a dog that has chewed through a shoe. The orders are quick, clipped, and absolute. Questioning them isn't just frowned upon, it's unimaginable. As the assignments roll past, you glance at the manuals stacked on the side table. Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management, thick as a brick, looms over the room like scripture. It isn't just recipes, it's a code of conduct. Beaton explains exactly how a servant should behave. Clean in body and clothing, humble in speech, respectful in manner, obedient without hesitation. She doesn't just tell you how to dust a grate. She tells you how to think about dusting a grate. Imagine a manual that controls every inch of your existence. When to rise, when to eat, how to fold your hands when standing in the presence of the family. What words are acceptable, which conveniently are very few. Nothing says respect like being trained to polish a doorknob in silence. The absurdity is that you aren't even meant to show pride in your work. That would be too close to arrogance. Instead, you must master the art of disappearing into your duties. You may spend an hour on your knees scrubbing the marble floor until your arms shake. But if anyone notices you've done it wrong. The work is meant to shine, not you. The housekeeper rattles her keys again as she calls out the next name. You shift nervously. The sound is almost musical, except no one here dares hum along. In some households, those keys open storerooms filled with sugar, tea, soap, candles, precious commodities locked away because servants, apparently, cannot be trusted with temptation. The very fact that she carries them means she is the keeper of morality as well as supplies. Your name is called. You are told to clean the drawing room hearth, polish the dining room chairs, and assist in preparing for luncheon. It doesn't sound like much, not when spoken so swiftly, but each task will devour hours. You nod. You don't speak. Speaking invites reprimand. Silence is safer. Around you, others receive their assignments. The scullery maid is given her daily sentence of endless pans. A footman is told to prepare the carriages. The cook has already vanished into her steamy kingdom, barking at kitchen maids like a general. Every cog clicks into place. And then, just when you think it's over, the housekeeper adds her favorite line. And remember, the mistress may have further instructions. Those words mean disaster. The mistress is unpredictable. She might suddenly decide the silver is tarnished, the stair carpet crooked, the window panes smudged. She may require you to polish the brass door handle twice in one day, simply because the idea has occurred to her, and you must smile, bow, and say, "Yes, ma'am," as if polishing brass were the greatest privilege of your existence. You stand dismissed, but the mood in the servants' hall is grim. Everyone knows what the rest of the day will bring. Back-breaking labor layered with invisible rules, each one stricter than the last. As you step into the corridor, you hear the faint chime of the housekeeper's keys echoing behind you. That sound will follow you everywhere, a constant reminder that someone is always in charge, and that someone is never you. It's remarkable, really, how much order can be imposed with so little. A ring of keys, a book of rules, a mistress who can erase your position with a flick of her hand. Together, they reduce your life to obedience, repetition, and silence. And yet, you carry on, because that is what the machine demands. The family above stairs must never sense the grind of the gears below. You are not here to be noticed. You are here to make sure everything else is. So you head off to your duties, hands already sore, stomach still empty, ears ringing with orders you cannot forget. And in the quiet of the corridor, you can't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Softly, of course, because even laughter must be rationed here. After all, nothing says respect like being trained to polish a doorknob in silence. You've already worked yourself halfway to collapse, and it isn't even breakfast time. But don't get too excited, because in a Victorian household, breakfast doesn't mean comfort. It means hierarchy. And nowhere is that hierarchy more visible than in the servants' hall. The servants' hall is supposed to be a refuge, a place where the downstairs staff can gather, eat, and breathe for a moment. In reality, it's just another battlefield of etiquette and order. Long table, wooden chairs, plain crockery. At first glance, it seems simple, but the moment you step inside, you understand. This room has rules. At the head of the table sits the butler, carved from oak and dignity, every inch of him polished like the silver he guards. At the opposite end sits the housekeeper, her keys resting on the table like a crown of authority. Between them stretches the rest of the staff, arranged not by friendliness, not by chance, but by rank. The highest servants, the lady's maid, the valet, the cook, claim the upper places near the housekeeper and butler. Lower servants drift downward, toward the benches at the far end. And at the very bottom, perched awkwardly on the edge of the last seat, you find yourself. You don't need anyone to tell you where you belong. The stairs and silences do that for you. The order is strict. The butler lifts his fork. Only then does anyone else dare to begin. The butler chews slowly, savoring his porridge. The others follow. And when he lays his knife and fork neatly together on the plate, everyone else, whether hungry or not, must stop. If your spoon is still halfway to your mouth when he decides he's finished, too bad. Down it goes. Rules are rules. So you learn quickly. You eat fast. You chew as though your life depends on it, because in a way it does. The hall boy, poor thing, often goes hungry because he hasn't yet mastered the art of lightning speed eating. By the time he's halfway through his bread, the butler has folded his napkin, and the meal is over. The irony is hard to miss. Upstairs, the family will drift lazily into the breakfast room hours later, sipping tea, nibbling buttered toast, leisurely discussing the weather or the latest scandal in the Times. Their meals last as long as they please, unhurried and indulgent. Down here, you're expected to wolf down plain porridge and weak tea as if the act of eating were an inconvenience, an interruption to real work. And in truth, it is. Food isn't about pleasure below stairs. It's about fuel. Just enough to keep the machine running. Not enough to encourage conversation. Certainly not enough to foster rebellion. If you dare laugh too loudly, the housekeeper's stare will quiet you faster than a clap of thunder. What makes the whole scene absurd is that the same rules of hierarchy that govern upstairs, titles, precedents, etiquette, repeat themselves here, only with smaller wages and worse chairs. The family upstairs arranges itself by birth. The servants downstairs arrange themselves by job title. Everyone has someone to look down on. Even the cook, who smells perpetually of onions, sits higher in rank than the housemaids. The scullery maid at the bottom is expected to serve the very people who spend their days ordering her about. Think about that for a moment. You spend hours polishing copper pans until your fingers blister, and then you have to stand behind the cook's chair and serve her supper. Imagine clocking out after a long shift today, only to be told you must personally feed your manager dinner. That's the kind of twisted logic the servants' hall is built on. The food itself is plain but plentiful, at least compared to what the poorest Victorians outside the house survive on. Thick bread, porridge, perhaps a slice of cold meat if the kitchen is generous. Cast-off cuts from the family's meals are repurposed here, sometimes as stews, sometimes as suspiciously chewy pies. Servants joke about dripping, the fat skimmed from roasts, being their most reliable dish. But no one complains too loudly, not when silence is safer. The hall is also where gossip thrives. Not loud gossip, whispered, careful gossip. Who's visiting upstairs? Which daughter has caught a suitor's eye? Whether the master's accounts are as strong as they appear. It's the servants who know the true pulse of the household, but they trade information like contraband, each tidbit wrapped in discretion. After all, the wrong word in the wrong ear could send you packing. And yet, for all its rigidity, there's something oddly comforting about the hall. It's the one place where you see the full range of downstairs society gathered together. The butler with his dignified calm, the cook wiping flour from her apron, the scullery maid barely able to keep her eyes open. You recognize yourself in their fatigue, in their silent endurance. No matter how different the ranks, everyone here lives under the same burden, invisibility to the world above. You chew your bread quickly, listening to the scrape of cutlery, the occasional cough, the faint creak of the house above waking slowly. The hall feels suspended between two worlds, the luxury upstairs and the labor downstairs. Here you get just enough to keep moving, but never enough to forget where you stand. The butler finishes. His fork rests against the plate with quiet finality. Chairs scrape, benches shift, and the meal is done. Your hunger is only half satisfied, but the rule is the rule. The scullery maid gathers the dishes. The housekeeper jingles her keys. The machine stirs again. And as you rise from the bench, still chewing your last bite of bread before someone notices, you can't help but smirk at the absurdity of it all. This is your society. Not the glittering balls and drawing rooms upstairs, but this plain table, these rigid rules, this race to finish a meal before the butler's jaw gets tired. Welcome to the servants' hall, the grand stage of hierarchy, only with porridge instead of champagne. Breakfast. If you can call half-chewed bread and rushed gulps of tea breakfast, is over. The butler has laid down his fork, the housekeeper has rattled her keys, and now it's time for one of the most dreaded duties in any Victorian household: laundry. Do not imagine, for 1 second, A tidy stack of folded shirts being whisked away into a machine that hums quietly while you scroll through your phone. Forget fabric softener. Forget detergent in neat plastic bottles. Laundry day in the 19th century is a campaign, long, brutal, and fought with buckets, boilers, and sheer human endurance. You begin by fetching water, and fetching more water, and then fetching even more water until your arms ache and your shoulders feel as though they might detach entirely. Each pail must be carried from the pump down the yard or up from the scullery cistern. Each one sloshes just enough to soak your apron and splash your boots. And this is before you've even started the real work. Once you have enough water to drown an army, it has to be heated. Copper boilers are stoked with coal, flames licking at the base, steam rising in clouds that choke the air and slick your hair to your forehead. The heat is suffocating, your skin prickling with sweat, even as the back of your neck stays chilled from the drafts creeping through the stone floor. By now you smell like a mixture of damp wool and smoke, but there's no time to care. Then comes the scrubbing. Garments are plunged into the steaming water, stirred with wooden paddles, and beaten against washboards until the dirt finally surrenders. Your hands sting from the scalding heat, then crack from the cold rinse. Lye soap bites into your skin until it peels raw. And if you're lucky enough to be assigned the finer garments, lace collars, silk gowns, delicate trimmings, your ordeal isn't over. Every piece of lace must be unpicked, washed separately, and stitched back into place by hand. Hours of careful sewing, just to restore an outfit the mistress will wear once before declaring it out of fashion. And yes, congratulations. You've just spent 3 hours washing someone else's underwear. You'll never afford your own silk dress, but at least you can starch theirs until it could stand upright on its own. Laundry isn't just hard work, it's relentless. Collars and cuffs must be scrubbed white, then starched stiff enough to slice bread. Dye runs easily, so colors must be washed separately, each pile demanding fresh buckets, fresh boiling, fresh hands blistered all over again. There is no convenient, delicate cycle here. There is only your aching back, the endless piles of garments, and the knowledge that the pile will never shrink. By the time you hang the last shirt to dry, more have already been added. Clothing, in Victorian England, is expensive. Far too expensive to throw away just because it's stained or frayed. So garments are patched, mended, and recycled endlessly. Every sock is darned, every sheet rehemmed, every apron sewn until the fabric is more repair than original. And who does this ceaseless mending? You. Because if you have free time, and you won't, it will be spent darning holes in someone else's stockings. Even drying the laundry is an ordeal. Without radiators or heated airing cupboards, clothes are hauled outside, pegged onto lines in the cold wind. In winter, they freeze stiff as boards, clattering like sails in a storm. Indoors, sheets are draped over racks near the range, turning the kitchen into a humid jungle of damp linen. And because clothing theft is such a problem, someone, often you, has to sit and watch the laundry as it dries, guarding it like a treasure chest. Imagine babysitting socks for hours. That is your life now. And remember, this isn't once a week. In a household with dozens of people, laundry is constant. Sheets, towels, undergarments, tablecloths, napkins, uniforms. The stream never ends. Every day is laundry day. Some houses even hire charwomen to help with the sheer scale of it. You, of course, don't get help. You are the help. The scale is staggering. Picture a dinner party upstairs. 15 guests, each with multiple courses, each course requiring spotless napkins, crisp tablecloths, and servants in clean livery. That single event means hundreds of items for you to scrub the next morning. A wealthy family with children multiplies the chaos. Babies with constant laundry, nursemaids demanding fresh linen, school uniforms to press. And all of it flows back to you, like an endless tide. Laundry Day is so notorious that even Mrs. Beeton, patron saint of the Victorian mistress, writes about it with a tone of faint dread. She advises mistresses to manage their staff wisely, to prevent idleness during laundry, as though anyone elbow-deep in boiling suds has time to be idle. For you, idleness doesn't exist. You are expected to scrub until your hands are raw, then sew until your eyes blur, then carry more water because the next batch has already begun. The irony is that this is invisible labor. The family upstairs doesn't think about where their clean collars come from, or who has kept their napkins white enough to pass inspection. They only notice when something is wrong. A spot missed, a hem undone, a collar too limp. Then, and only then, your work is acknowledged, with scolding. So you keep going. Because what else is there? You haul, you boil, you scrub, you stitch. The rhythm becomes mechanical. Bucket, boiler, soap, scrub, wring, rinse, repeat. You lose count of the shirts. You forget how many stockings you've mended. The day blurs into a haze of steam and exhaustion. By nightfall, you'll be sore, blistered, and numb. And tomorrow, you'll do it all over again, because the laundry never ends. And as you pin another stiffened collar to the line, watching it flap like a white flag in the wind, you can't help but laugh, quietly, bitterly, at the absurdity of it. You'll never own clothes this fine, never walk in society, never glide through a ballroom in silk and lace. But at least, in this strange inversion of fate, you can claim expertise in caring for garments you'll never be allowed to wear. Welcome to Victorian laundry, endless, invisible, and in its own miserable way, perfectly pressed. So far, you've hauled coal, scrubbed floors, and washed enough linen to outfit a small army. Your life is sore muscles and cracked skin. But now, let's step sideways in the servant hierarchy, into a role that's less about sweat and more about symmetry. Meet the footman. A footman's duties, on paper, don't sound so different from anyone else's: opening doors, carrying dishes, hauling coal, waiting at table. But the real job description is simpler. It can be summed up in one sentence: look good while doing it. That's right. Footmen are chosen less for skill and more for height, symmetry, and the ability to look impressive in livery. Families liked their footmen tall, broad-shouldered, and if possible, identical in build. Why? Because nothing screams prestige like having two 6-foot men in matching uniforms open the doors of your carriage at the same time. Forget efficiency. This is about theater. Your worth as a footman depends on how symmetrical you look in powdered livery. Truly a career highlight. All those years of polishing boots and running errands, only to discover that your face, not your hands, is the real qualification. The livery itself is half the ordeal. Imagine wearing a stiff, brightly colored uniform, knee breeches, stockings, tailcoat, modeled on fashions that went out of style for ordinary people decades earlier. The 18th century may have passed, but the uniform stayed, so that footmen looked like ornamental throwbacks stationed in the 19th century. Powdered wigs had largely disappeared by Queen Victoria's time, but the livery still gave them that faintly ridiculous air of living dolls. And make no mistake, you are a doll, a very expensive one, because footmen cost money. far more than a maid or scullery hand. You are a status symbol, proof to the world that your employer has enough wealth to maintain servants who serve no practical purpose except to impress guests and strangers. Having a footman meant the family could say, "Look at us. We're so grand. We hire men to stand around looking decorative." Of course, decoration isn't the only duty. You shadow the family constantly. At table, you stand silent behind chairs, waiting for the smallest signal. A glance, a tilt of the head, the faint clink of cutlery. At the door, you are the first face a visitor sees, and your posture and polish reflect directly on the household. In the carriage, you ride at the back, clinging in the wind and rain, ready to leap down the instant a wheel sticks or a horse falters. Dinner service is the ultimate stage. You carry in dishes with the precision of a ballet dancer, present plates with a bow, and retreat without a sound. You may spend hours polishing silverware before the meal, only to spend the meal itself standing like a statue, knees stiff, back aching, pretending you are not in agony. And when guests leave, you are at the door again, bowing as though you enjoyed every second. The irony is that while you appear glamorous, your life is still grueling. Behind the livery and polish, you're scrubbing boots, carrying coal, and cleaning silver until it gleams like ice. You just have to look handsome while you do it. The family doesn't want their guests to see the sweat, only the surface, and you are the surface. Families took pride in matching pairs of footmen. If you happen to be roughly the same height and build as another servant, congratulations. You just became half of a set. Together, you would open doors in unison, stand at the carriage in mirrored poses, and generally exist as human bookends. The closer the resemblance, the higher the prestige. Somewhere in the hierarchy of Victorian absurdities, being nearly identical to another man was considered a mark of refinement. And yes, your rank is slightly higher than that of a maid, but don't let that go to your head. Footmen were often mocked by the public for being ornamental. Satirical cartoons showed them as vain, preening, overly perfumed. In fact, powdered footmen became a byword for useless luxury. You might look impressive, but everyone knows you're essentially a decorative lamp with legs. Still, being ornamental has its perks. Unlike the scullery maid, you eat better food, sometimes even sharing in the leftovers from upstairs. You may have a private livery room with your uniform kept spotless, and guests, wealthy, careless guests, sometimes slip tips into your hand, recognizing that at least you're the servant they actually notice. But there's a catch. Because you're so visible, you're also under constant scrutiny. Guests might comment on your height, your posture, even your calves. The mistress of the house might criticize how you bow, how you walk, how you breathe. If you are too handsome, there's the added suspicion that you might distract the young ladies, or worse, the mistress herself. If you are too clumsy, you embarrass the family in front of their peers. In either case, the blame falls squarely on you. And then there's the indignity of names. Some households never bother to learn their footmen's real names at all. The first footman is always called John, the second always Charles. You might be Thomas or Edward or George, but the moment you put on livery, you become John or Charles because tradition demands it. Imagine working years in a house where no one ever calls you by your real name, only by the placeholder assigned to your position. So yes, being a footman has its advantages: slightly better food, slightly better pay, slightly better clothing. But at its heart, the role is the same as every other servant's: to serve invisibly, silently, without complaint. Only in your case, the family wants you to look good doing it. You are the household's advertisement, proof that everything runs smoothly, that wealth is abundant, that appearances are spotless. You might dream of rising one day to butler, of trading in your ornamental livery for authority and keys. Some succeed, most don't. Most remain footmen until they're too old to look symmetrical, too stiff to stand for hours, too gray to pass as handsome. And then they are quietly replaced by the next tall young man who can fill the livery. So next time you see a Victorian illustration of a grand dinner or carriage procession, look past the chandeliers and gowns. Look at the man standing silently in the background, uniform crisp, posture rigid. That's the footman. His life is a strange mixture of drudgery and display, invisible in labor but unavoidable in appearance. And as you stand there, aching in silence, bowing as another guest sweeps by, you might just smile to yourself, because after all, your entire value has been reduced to symmetry in breeches. Truly, a career highlight. If the footman is the ornamental lamp in breeches, then the lady's maid and valet are the household's closest confidants, or at least they appear to be. These are the roles perched just beneath the family's orbit, orbiting closer to the sun than most servants ever dare. And yet, just like all the other roles below stairs, their closeness comes with strings attached, strings that can tighten around your neck at the slightest misstep. Start with the lady's maid. She is, in theory, the mistress's right hand. Her duties sound deceptively refined: styling hair, mending gowns, arranging jewels, keeping cosmetics tidy, stitching hems invisible to the eye. In practice, it's a role that veers constantly between artistry and drudgery. You may spend half an hour perfecting a delicate hairstyle, only to spend the next half hour scrubbing perspiration stains from a silk bodice. You may carefully polish ivory combs and silver-backed brushes, only to carry away the chamber pot when the mistress is through with her morning toilette. Nothing like being trusted to polish the comb and empty the chamber pot. Truly, intimacy comes in many forms. The valet mirrors this role on the male side of the household. His life is an endless choreography of buttons, cravats, and boots. He lays out the master's clothing for the day, ensures every crease is sharp, and ties cravats with the precision of an architect. He is also responsible for shaving and grooming, which means if the master arrives in society with a crooked sideburn, the valet takes the blame. And yes, he too must deal with less glamorous details, cleaning muddy boots, brushing dandruff from coats, or, in some cases, warming undergarments by the fire so that his employer's delicate skin never knows the shock of a cold seam. On paper, these positions are considered top drawer among the servant hierarchy. They carry prestige because they are trusted with the family's most personal possessions: their wardrobes, their grooming, their very appearances in public. Other servants sometimes look up at them with envy, imagining that proximity to power must come with some benefit. And yes, there are benefits. Ladies' maids and valets may receive better cast-off clothing, better tips, or even the occasional gift from their employers. They are spoken to more often, given a touch more privacy, treated with a veneer of respect. But let's not get carried away. Their status is fragile, balanced on the thinnest of blades. One mistake, one whisper of impropriety, and they can be dismissed overnight. A misplaced jewel, a wrinkle in a gown, a rumor of knowing too much, any of these can send them tumbling back into unemployment. The very intimacy that raises them up also makes them dangerous. They see what others don't. The mistress's letters, the master's vices, the private quarrels of the family. And in Victorian England, knowledge isn't power when you're a servant. It's liability. The relationship between mistress and maid, or master and valet, often blurs into something unsettling. They are not equals, never equals, but they share an intimacy that borders on dependency. Imagine standing behind the mistress every morning, brushing her hair while she stares into the mirror. She may confide in you, perhaps about her headaches, her anxieties, even her romantic disappointments. But she will still dismiss you without hesitation if you displease her. You are both confident and disposable tool, trusted with secrets one moment and reminded of your station the next. The valet experiences the same contradiction. He knows the master's weaknesses, how much brandy he drinks before dinner, how he disguises thinning hair, how often he frets over the cut of his trousers. He may be spoken to as though he were a friend, but he is never truly one. At best, he is a shadow, a reflection of the master's vanity polished until it gleams. And let's not forget the absurdity of the details. While you, as a housemaid, may be scrubbing coal dust from the grate, the lady's maid spends an hour ensuring a feather sits at the correct angle in a hat. While the scullery maid bleeds from washing pans, the valet devotes himself to making sure a shoe buckle is perfectly aligned. Status buys you out of some kinds of misery, but it locks you into others. The misery of pettiness, of endless attention to details that matter only because the family says they do. Of course, gossip circulates. Ladies' maids, with their ears so close to their mistresses, often know more than anyone else about the household scandals. Suitors, debts, secret letters, all pass under their watchful eyes. And valets, with their quiet presence in the master's rooms, are privy to things no polite society guest would ever be allowed to see. But gossip is a dangerous currency. A careless word in the servants' hall can cost you your post, because if there's one thing the family fears more than incompetent service, it's exposure. So yes, the lady's maid and valet are higher than you in rank. They eat nearer the butler and housekeeper. They receive better perquisites, and they walk with a little more dignity. But don't be fooled. They are still servants, still bound by silence, still dismissed at a whim. Their lives are a tightrope walk, too invisible, and they're forgotten, too visible, and they're a threat. As you watch them glide past in the corridor, the valet carrying a folded coat with the gravity of a priest, the lady's maid clutching a basket of ribbons and pins, you might feel a pang of envy. They seem so important, so trusted. But then you remember, their worth lies in another's reflection. Their entire existence is built on dressing someone else, grooming someone else, polishing someone else. And perhaps you feel the faintest flicker of relief. At least your own misery is honest. Coal dust, soap burns, aching muscles. At least no one asks you to stand quietly in the corner while warming another person's undergarments by the fire. So the next time you tie your own shoelaces or brush your own hair, take a moment to be grateful. In a Victorian household, those little acts of independence would be luxuries reserved for the masters. For their servants, intimacy was labor, trust was burden, and status was as fragile as the lace they spent hours sewing back into place. And just like that lace, the people behind these stories were fragile too. Stitched in, then forgotten. If you don't subscribe, you're helping history repeat itself, letting the servant vanish while the finery remains. You may think you're young now, 14 perhaps, maybe only 12. But in Victorian England, youth is not a stage of life. It's a stage of labor. Childhood, as you imagine it today, schoolyards, games, lazy afternoons, doesn't exist for you. The moment your hands are large enough to carry a bucket, you are put to work. Many servants began their lives below stairs as children, 10, 11, 12 years old, the age when you might dream of adventure or books or mischief. Instead, became the age of sculleries and soot. Your parents, if you were lucky enough to still have them, signed you into service because the family needed money, or at least one less mouth to feed. And so, you traded childhood for a uniform, play for pots, freedom for endless chores. The lowest rung on this ladder is the scullery maid. Her world is water, grease, and cold stone floors. Morning to night, she scrubs pans large enough to boil an ox, her hands perpetually wrinkled from soaking in icy water. When she isn't scrubbing, she's fetching more water. When she isn't fetching, she's sweeping ash or peeling vegetables or scraping scraps into the pig bucket. If the kitchen is the heart of the house, the scullery is the stomach, and she is the acid that dissolves the leftovers. Imagine your skin cracked raw, red with lye soap, nails chipped until they bleed. That is the life of the scullery maid, day after day, year after year. Her hands never dry, her apron never clean, her hair perpetually smelling of smoke and cabbage. She is the bottom of the hierarchy, the last to eat, the first to be blamed, the easiest to replace. If you are not a girl, perhaps you are the hall boy. His life is no easier. He sleeps in the dining room, on a folding bed that can be tucked away in daylight. His task is simple. Be available at all times. Lamps to polish, boots to clean, errands to run, chamber pots to empty. He is the human version of a bell, expected to spring up whenever someone pulls the cord. And he is always tired. Always. The hall boy may nap sitting upright in a chair, head lolling, only to be woken and ordered to fetch something within seconds. Think of it as boarding school, except you never graduate. No headmaster arrives to hand you a diploma. No proud family beams from the audience. You simply get older, stiffer, and more exhausted, and eventually someone younger replaces you at the bottom. Child servants were often treated with less patience than adults. They were shouted at, cuffed on the ear, or given extra chores as punishment. They learned early that tears solved nothing. Cry too much, and you might be sent away without reference, which meant unemployment, which meant destitution. So children hardened themselves, their small backs bending under burdens too large for them, their eyes adjusting to the dim kitchens and cellars where they would spend their days. There is a strange irony here. For wealthy families, children were to be cherished, indulged, educated. Upstairs, little masters and mistresses played with toy soldiers and porcelain dolls, their only worry being whether the nursemaid had remembered jam with their bread. Downstairs, children the same age were hauling buckets heavier than themselves, their games replaced with endless repetition. Two childhoods in one house, divided by a single staircase. Still, some children carved out moments of resilience. Hall boys whispered jokes to each other as they polished boots, snickering quietly until the butler scowled them into silence. Scullery maids hummed songs while scrubbing pans, the music echoing faintly against the stone walls. A stolen crust of bread, a few minutes sitting on the back step, a glance at the night sky before collapsing into sleep. These were luxuries disguised as ordinary moments. And while you may pity them, remember, they were not pitied in their own time. Service was considered respectable work, far better than begging in the streets or toiling in a factory. A child in service might be exhausted, yes, but she was also fed, clothed, and housed. To Victorian society, that was more than enough. That the child was robbed of innocence was not considered a tragedy, only a necessity. Of course, the work left its scars. Housemaid's knee plagued even the youngest girls from constant scrubbing on stone floors. Backs bent early from lifting pails. Fingers stiffened with arthritis before adulthood. And education? Forget it. A hall boy might learn a little reading, enough to decipher the labels on bottles of polish. A scullery maid might never learn more than her prayers. The family's children learned Latin declensions. The servants' children learned how to wring a rag dry. And yet, there is something grimly impressive in their endurance. To be 12 and survive such drudgery is to build a resilience most modern people would never dream of. They did not have the choice to refuse. They simply did the work because the alternative was worse. So when you imagine yourself as a Victorian servant child, crouched over a tub with raw hands or nodding half asleep beside a dying fire, remember, this was not unusual. It was ordinary. It was the baseline of existence for thousands of children across Britain. Their laughter was rare, their play stolen, their futures uncertain, and yet they endured. And you? Well, you might laugh at the absurdity, the idea of warming someone else's stockings while your own feet freeze. Or you might shiver at the injustice. Either way, in this world, childhood is over before it begins. Because in the servant's hierarchy, you do not grow up, you are put to work. And if you're lucky, you survive long enough to trade one endless chore for another. You've been in service long enough now to know that the real burden of the job isn't just the coal dust, the laundry, or even the endless stairs. No, the real burden is the rules. Because in a Victorian household, rules are everywhere. They're written in manuals, enforced by the butler and housekeeper, and lived out in every minute of your day. Take the manuals, for instance. Hints to Domestic Servants, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, and countless others. These thick tomes were less helpful guide and more instruction manual for the obedient automaton. They didn't just tell you how to cook or clean, they told you how to exist. Be humble, be silent, be clean, both in body and mind. Rise early, speak rarely, bow often. If your employer so much as looks in your direction, you are expected to radiate meekness. These books presented service as a moral calling, not just a job. Servants were told to be loyal, pious, and grateful for the privilege of drudgery. To be obedient was to be virtuous. To complain was to reveal a corrupt heart. In other words, work wasn't only labor, it was a test of your soul. And if you failed, well, the punishment came swiftly. Employers didn't just expect obedience, they expected paranoia. Some planted coins around the house as traps, testing to see if you were honest enough to leave them untouched. Imagine scrubbing a carpet and noticing a shiny sixpence glinting under the table. Do you leave it, even as your stomach growls for want of bread? You'd better. Because if you so much as look at it too long, someone may accuse you of theft. The family congratulates itself on its cleverness. You simply lose your livelihood. Speaking of which, sickness is no defense. In fact, it's one of the fastest ways to lose your position. Catch a fever, collapse from exhaustion, even twist an ankle on the stairs, and you're out. There's no paid leave, no take a day to rest. A sick servant is a useless servant, and useless servants are replaced. Victorian job security meant you could be unemployed before you finished scrubbing the floor you were fired on. And don't even think about answering back. To question an order is to question the entire structure of the household. A single sharp word, a flash of temper, and you might find yourself dismissed without reference. That word, reference, was everything. A character, as it was called, was your passport to the next job. Without one, no other respectable household would take you in. So when you're scolded unfairly, when you're accused of carelessness, you didn't commit, you bite your tongue. Because losing your character is worse than enduring humiliation. Punishments weren't always written in manuals, but they were understood. A scullery maid might be made to redo an entire day's work if a single dish looked spotted. A hall boy might be forced to polish boots until the early hours as a lesson in diligence. Housemaids caught whispering or laughing were sent back to scrub the stairs, one by one, as penance for their frivolity. And then, of course, there was the ultimate punishment, dismissal. Dismissal could come without warning, without pay, without mercy. A broken vase, a missing spoon, a perceived insolence. Any of these could end your employment. For the wealthy family, it was a minor inconvenience. For you, it was disaster. Homelessness, hunger, perhaps even the workhouse. That threat lingered in every order, every glance, every white-gloved inspection. What makes it all more absurd is that these punishments were often disguised as moral lessons. Employers liked to see themselves not just as masters, but as guardians of their servants' character. To them, scolding wasn't cruelty, it was improving. Dismissing a servant wasn't heartless, it was teaching responsibility. They genuinely believed that by making your life miserable, they were molding you into a better human being. Of course, you might argue the rules were necessary. After all, households were large, and order had to be maintained. Without discipline, the servants' hall could descend into chaos. But in practice, the rules served one purpose: to remind you of your place. Every curfew, every prohibition on laughter, every lecture about honesty reinforced the same lesson. You are not a person with autonomy. You are an extension of the family's will. And the cruelest part? You believed it. Or at least, you learned to act as though you did. Day after day, the rules seeped into your bones until you rose early, not because the bell demanded it, but because you could no longer imagine doing otherwise. Silence became natural. Deference became instinct. Punishments became part of the rhythm of your life, like meals or prayers. So here you are, kneeling on the floor, scrubbing a stain that may or may not even exist, terrified that the mistress will appear and point out an invisible speck of dust. You know the rules. Keep your head down. Keep your mouth shut. Don't touch the coin glinting in the corner. Don't cough. Don't stumble. Don't falter. And above all, don't forget, your worth here is measured in obedience, not ability. It's a strange kind of existence. You survive by being silent, invisible, replaceable. And yet, in that silence, you begin to lose something more important: yourself. Because in this world, rules are not just about work, they are about control. And if you're not careful, they don't just tell you how to polish the floor, they tell you how to think while you polish it. You've scrubbed, polished, hauled, bowed, and been scolded. At this point, you may be wondering, surely even a Victorian servant must have had some free time, a moment to breathe, a few precious hours to call their own. Well, sort of. But don't get too excited. Free time, for servants, was a slippery thing. It existed only in the gaps between labor, only when every order had been completed, every floor scrubbed, every grate relit. It was measured not in hours, but in minutes, snatched like crumbs from the edge of a table. For most servants, leisure was so rare that the very idea of spare time felt more like a rumor than a reality. And even when you had a few moments, those moments were tightly policed. Reading, for example. You might imagine curling up with a novel in the corner of the servants' hall, escaping into Dickens or Austen. Forget it. Novels were often frowned upon, especially for younger maids. Too much imagination, they said, led to discontent. You were permitted the Bible, a prayer book, perhaps an improving tract. But heaven forbid you pick up a love story. That might give you ideas, and ideas were dangerous currency in a world built on obedience. What you were allowed to do was sewing. Always sewing. Needles clicked in the servants' hall late into the evening, hands moving automatically to mend sheets, darn socks, repair aprons. The best perk of the job? You might be allowed to mend the sheets after you finish scrubbing them. Leisure, Victorian style, meant continuing the work at a slightly slower pace, with slightly less shouting. For some servants, this was the only chance to put something of themselves into their labor. Take Elizabeth Parker, for instance. She was a housemaid in the 1830s who left behind something extraordinary, a stitched diary. With needle and thread, she embroidered her life story onto cloth. At first glance, it looks like a sampler, the kind young girls practiced on. But her words reveal trauma, abuse, despair, the crushing weight of service. Her story wasn't written in ink, because servants didn't always have paper or time for that. It was sewn, hidden in stitches, preserved in fabric that spoke silently for her. It's a reminder that for many servants, leisure wasn't freedom. It was just another space where silence and control lingered. Expression had to be coded, hidden, disguised. To write openly might be seen as defiance. To stitch your story into cloth was safer. After all, to the mistress, it just looked like embroidery practice. And what about socializing? The truth is, opportunities were scarce. The servants' hall was too rigid, too monitored, to allow much genuine conversation. Meals were hurried, gossip whispered carefully, laughter stifled at the sound of the housekeeper's keys. Flirtations happened, of course, a stolen glance, a quiet word in a passageway, perhaps even a meeting on the back stairs. But romance was risky. If discovered, it could mean dismissal for both parties. And without a reference, without that precious character, finding another post could be impossible. Isolation was the natural state. You worked alongside others, yes, but the hierarchy and the sheer exhaustion kept you apart. Friendships were possible, but fragile. Any moment, one of you might be sent away, dismissed without warning, and the bond would vanish overnight. Servants learned not to grow too attached. People came and went. The work remained. On Sundays, if you were lucky, you might get a few hours for church. This was the closest thing to recreation for many, not because of the sermons, though they were unavoidable, but because church was the only chance to leave the house, to see other faces, to feel part of the wider world. For a few precious minutes, you weren't just a servant in livery or apron. You were another body in the pews, singing the same hymns as everyone else. Of course, you had to hurry back. The fires still needed stoking. The meals still needed preparing. God may have rested on the seventh day, but Victorian servants certainly didn't. And so your free time slips by, a handful of minutes with a needle, a whispered joke with a fellow maid, a stolen breath of fresh air at the back door. It's never quite enough. It never feels like leisure. It feels instead like the faintest glimpse of what life might have been if you weren't trapped in this endless cycle of work. There's a strange irony here. Leisure was dangerous because it gave you the chance to think. And thinking, for servants, was not encouraged. Idle minds were seen as rebellious minds. Better to keep you busy, always busy, until you collapse into straw mattresses at night, too tired to imagine another life. So if you find yourself drifting now, half asleep as you listen, remember, even that luxury, the ability to lie still, undisturbed, with a mind free to wander, would have been unimaginable to most Victorian servants. Their minds were tethered to their tasks, their hands forever occupied, their spare time stolen back by the work that defined them. And in the rare moments when they did carve out something of themselves, a stitched sampler, a whispered song, a shared smile in the corridor, those fragments became their true acts of rebellion, small, quiet rebellions, stitched into the fabric of their lives. So yes, there was free time, but only barely. Only enough to remind you that you are human before the machine swallows you again. So far, we've wandered through the world of great houses, dozens of servants bustling below stairs, each cog turning in a machine so large it needs a butler and a housekeeper just to keep it from rattling apart. But most Victorians didn't live in palaces with 30 staff. The majority of middle-class families had just one servant. One. She was called the maid of all work, which is Victorian for one human attempting to replicate the labor output of 15 servants. If you think the big houses were hard, imagine being the only servant in a house where the family expects the same spotless results, but without the backup. There is no butler to manage, no scullery maid to wash dishes, no hall boy to polish boots. It's just you, running from room to room, trying desperately to keep a family's illusions intact. Your day begins even earlier than in the great houses. Fires to light, water to fetch, floors to scrub, and by the time the family descends for breakfast, you're expected to have completed a list long enough to exhaust 3 servants. Not just one. The table must be laid, the food prepared, the children dressed, the hearth cleaned, the windows wiped, all before anyone in the family yawns good morning. And once breakfast is done, congratulations. You now have a mountain of dishes to wash, a fresh round of rooms to tidy, chamber pots to empty, clothes to press, beds to make, and errands to run. The maid of all work doesn't just serve meals. She cooks them, cleans up after them, and then cleans the kitchen too. She doesn't just wash the laundry. She carries the water, stokes the boiler, scrubs the stains, dries the sheets, and irons every piece. She doesn't just sweep. She scrubs until the floors are bright enough for the mistress to trail a white glove across them without complaint. And the tasks multiply endlessly. Groceries must be fetched, coal must be hauled, windows must be polished, children must be minded when the mistress goes calling. And of course, the bell can ring at any moment, summoning you upstairs for whatever whim the master or mistress deems urgent. You have no comrades in the servants' hall, no footmen to share the burden, no scullery maid to drown in soapsuds beside you. Your only company is the ticking clock reminding you how late you are for your next duty. The house doesn't feel like a workplace, it feels like a treadmill, and you're the only one running. The absurdity of it is obvious. In big houses, at least you can specialize. One person washes dishes, another stokes fires, another polishes silver. But in a middle-class household, you are a one-person orchestra, playing every instrument at once while the conductor, the mistress, waves her baton in constant criticism. Victorian manuals describe the maid of all work as the most cheerfully useful of all servants, which is a polite way of saying she worked herself into exhaustion and had no choice but to smile while doing it. Her hours were brutal, her tasks were endless, and her pay was minimal, often less than that of specialized servants in larger households. Socially, she was also the lowest of the low. Having just one servant didn't stop the mistress from expecting deference. The maid still had to address her employers with respect, stand when spoken to, obey instantly. But the grandeur of a large staff was missing. Instead, the maid of all work carried the burden of an entire household on her own shoulders, with none of the prestige that came from working in a grand estate. It's here, perhaps, that the comparison to modern life becomes clearest. The maid of all work was, in many ways, the Victorian gig worker. Hired cheaply, overburdened with tasks, expected to do the jobs of several people, and discarded when she faltered. Just as delivery drivers today juggle multiple orders, or freelancers wear the hats of designer, marketer, and accountant all at once, the maid of all work spun in a constant cycle of exhaustion with no union, no safety net, and no recognition. And like gig workers, she was invisible. The family did not praise her efficiency, nor marvel at her endurance. They expected her to keep pace, to juggle every demand, to deliver perfection without complaint. If she failed, there was always another desperate young woman ready to take her place. Leisure? Forget it. With no other staff to share the load, the maid of all work often worked from before dawn until after midnight. Her meals were rushed, her sleep short, her bones perpetually tired. Even Sundays, which in theory might offer a few hours' respite, were often consumed by catching up on tasks neglected during the week. And yet, despite the misery, this role was common. Thousands of middle-class homes relied on a single servant to uphold the illusion of respectability. To have no servant at all was to risk looking poor. To have one, however overworked, was to maintain a fragile veneer of gentility. And so young girls from the countryside poured into towns and cities, trading fields for fireplaces, freedom for servitude. Picture yourself in her shoes, carrying a bucket in each hand, soot smudged across your face, apron damp, heart racing as you race from kitchen to nursery to parlor. You're too busy to think, too tired to dream, too isolated to hope. You are, effectively, an entire servants' hall compressed into one exhausted body. Basically, you are one human trying to replicate the labor output of 15 servants. And for this miracle of multitasking, you are paid less than the footman who spends his day looking symmetrical in breeches. So yes, the grand estates may dazzle us with their scale, their armies of staff, their glittering hierarchies. But for most servants, the story was smaller, lonelier, and far more punishing. It wasn't the glamour of the great house. It was the grind of the middle-class home. And the maid of all work? She carried it all, every dish, every scuttle, every order, alone. And if you leave without subscribing, you're leaving me to carry all this work the same way, doing everything with nothing to show for it. If the butler is the iron hand of order below stairs, the mistress of the house is the iron hand above. She may glide through her drawing room in silks and lace, but don't be fooled. She is the commander of this domestic army, and her commands often land hardest on you. Mrs. Beeton, that Victorian oracle of household management, described the mistress as nothing less than the general of the household. Her duty was to direct her staff, manage expenses, and uphold moral standards. It all sounds very grand, very noble, but what it usually meant was, she spent her mornings discovering what you've done wrong. Suspicion was her constant companion. Servants, she was sure, were always on the edge of laziness, dishonesty, or, the greatest sin of all, ideas above their station. Heaven forbid a maid grow fond of a ribbon, or a footman walk too confidently down the street. That whiff of independence might be mistaken for ambition, and ambition was an unforgivable trait in someone whose life was meant to orbit hers. You could work 12 hours without pause, polish the silver until you see your reflection frowning back at you, and still, she might frown at the angle of a teacup or the placement of a cushion. It wasn't the work itself that mattered, it was the performance of authority. Every correction reminded you of the hierarchy. She commanded, you obeyed. The suspicion grew in strange directions. Some mistresses accused their servants of stealing soap, as if you were hoarding the family's wealth in lather. Others insisted that novels corrupted maids, so books were banned. And heaven help the servant caught borrowing a ribbon or scrap of lace. Even if you returned it, spotless and pressed, the mere act of touching finery not your own could be seen as theft of dignity. Consider Jane Carlyle, wife of the famous writer Thomas Carlyle. Her letters are filled with complaints about her servants. Endless complaints. The housemaid is too slow, the cook too careless, the laundress incompetent. Reading her correspondence, you get the impression that the greatest trial of her life was finding a servant who didn't crumble under her endless criticism. Servants came and went so quickly from the Carlyle household that the front door might as well have had a revolving hinge. And still, Jane wondered why her staff never seemed to last. It's hard to manage staff when they keep quitting after 3 weeks of abuse. Shocking, really. But Jane Carlyle was hardly unique. Many mistresses seemed locked in a battle with their servants, one side determined to assert control, the other struggling simply to endure. The family upstairs lived in constant fear of losing their dignity, and they projected that fear onto you. If the toast was burnt, it reflected badly on the mistress's management. If the room was dusty, it was her shame before her friends. And so her reputation depended entirely on your invisible labor, which meant she had to watch you like a hawk. This paranoia wasn't confined to the household. Victorian society at large whispered anxiously about servants. Satirical magazines were filled with cartoons of lazy maids, drunken footmen, and scheming cooks. The mistress reading these was convinced that without her strict eye, you'd be slipping gin into the soup and entertaining strangers in the pantry. And so, you lived under suspicion. Every glance, every sigh, every raised eyebrow from the mistress carried weight. She might not strike you herself, that wasn't her role, but she could cut your livelihood in an instant. With one complaint to the housekeeper, one shake of the head to the butler, your character could be ruined, your reference tainted, your future wrecked. The irony, of course, is that mistresses often relied more heavily on their servants than they realized. Without you, their houses would dissolve into chaos. Without you, their reputations would crumble. But gratitude was rare. Instead, they wrapped their dependence in suspicion, as if constant vigilance excused their constant need. Imagine being watched while you dust, not for the sake of dust, but to reassure the mistress that her household, and by extension her status, was firmly under her control. Imagine being scolded not for failing, but for daring to exist too comfortably in the space she considered hers. It created a strange intimacy, too. The lady's maid, for instance, might hear her mistress's secrets, but never be trusted with her respect. A parlor maid might spend more hours in the mistress's presence than the mistress's own children did, but still be seen as invisible. Servants lived in the margins of their employers' lives, too close to ignore, too far to acknowledge. And the result was tension. Daily, grinding, exhausting tension. You knew the mistress's moods before she spoke. You knew the sound of her step in the hall, the rustle of her skirts, the tone that meant danger. Her presence was the constant reminder that however hard you worked, however much you gave, you would never belong. So yes, the mistress was the commander of the household, but what she commanded, more than order, was unease. Her authority rested on suspicion, her dignity on your exhaustion, and her greatest fear was that one day you might forget your place and remember your worth. You've now lived through the endless laundry, the suspicion of mistresses, the rigid hierarchy of the servants' hall, and the sheer misery of dusting coal dust while breathing coal dust. At this point, you might wonder, why on earth did anyone stay? Why didn't they all simply walk out? Well, eventually, many of them did. By the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, the servant problem became one of the great talking points of polite society. Not servant problem, as in, we treat them like disposable tools and perhaps that's an issue. No, the problem was that mistresses couldn't keep hold of them. Servants were vanishing. The domestic machine that once hummed with endless hands began to sputter. Why? Because other industries beckoned, and compared to service, they looked suspiciously like freedom. Factories, shops, clerical offices, these weren't exactly paradises. The air in factories was choking, the pay in shops was poor, and clerks often lived lives of monotony under piles of paperwork. But here's the difference. In those jobs, when the clock struck the end of the day, you went home. No bells ringing in the night, no mistress summoning you to polish a doorknob at 11 o'clock, no expectation that your entire existence belonged to someone else. When even factories look like paradise, you know you're in trouble. Factories also offered something else. Service rarely did. Wages you could actually keep track of. In service, food and lodging were part of your pay. That sounded generous on paper, but it was also a convenient excuse to keep cash wages miserably low. In a factory, you earned money. Not much, but enough to budget, enough to save, maybe even enough to buy something that belonged only to you. Shops, too, had their appeal. Becoming a shop girl or shop boy meant standing long hours, certainly, but it also meant being part of the bustling public. You were visible. You weren't hidden away in basements and attics. You stood behind counters, spoke to customers, and saw daylight. You wore your own clothes instead of uniforms designed to erase your individuality. For many, that alone was worth the trade. And here's the other truth. Domestic service had no unions, no collective bargaining, no protective laws. While factory workers gradually began to demand, and sometimes win, limits on hours or improvements in safety, servants remained trapped in a system that pretended the old paternalism still worked. The mistress was supposed to be your protector, your moral guide, the benevolent commander of her household. In reality, she was your most immediate threat. Your hours had no end, your wages were at her discretion, and your reference, your character, could vanish with one petty complaint. No time off, no voice, no recourse. If you grew ill, you were dismissed. If you complained, you were dismissed. If you so much as hinted at wanting a personal life, you were dismissed. There is no union for the dismissed. By the turn of the century, servants began voting with their feet. They drifted toward industries where, even if the work was hard, at least they had some boundary between self and employer. At least they weren't expected to live in the same house, eat under surveillance, and sleep in drafty attics. Another blow came in the form of the uniform. As the 19th century wore on, households standardized the appearance of their servants. Maids in black with crisp white aprons, footmen in stiff livery, kitchen staff in starched whites. On one hand, it projected order. Guests could instantly recognize each servant's role. On the other hand, it erased whatever individuality was left. Once, servants might at least wear slightly modified versions of their own clothing, patched and repurposed from the mistress's cast-offs. But with uniforms, you were no longer yourself. You were the maid, the footman, the cook. A position, not a person. And when your employer can't be bothered to remember your name, when you are simply Mary, like the last 3 maids before you, the appeal of leaving grows stronger every day. Mistresses were horrified. The servant crisis filled columns of advice manuals. They complained that girls today were lazy, frivolous, unwilling to put up with hard work. They wrung their hands that young men chose factory floors or railway jobs over polished livery. And yet, they never seemed to ask themselves why someone might prefer choking coal dust in a factory to the constant indignity of polishing chamber pots in silence. The numbers tell the story. By the early 20th century, domestic service, once the single largest employer of women in Britain, began to shrink. Factories, shops, and offices expanded. The new consumer economy had little room for entire armies of servants. Middle-class families could still hire a maid of all work, perhaps, but the days of households with 20 or 30 staff were dwindling. For those who remained, the grind didn't change. No laws arrived to shorten their hours. No unions fought their battles. But they were no longer alone. They could see their peers leaving, finding something better, building new kinds of lives. And once you see a way out, staying put feels less like loyalty and more like a prison sentence. So the decline of service wasn't sudden, but steady. A tide pulling workers away from attics and basements into streets, shops, factories, and eventually offices. Service never disappeared entirely. Even today, echoes of it linger in cleaners, nannies, cooks, and drivers. But the great age of servants, when every respectable home was staffed by a silent army, was over. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the decline wasn't caused by servants rebelling or unions marching or governments reforming. It was caused by something far simpler. Given the faintest whiff of alternatives, however grim, people left. Because service was never just about work. It was about control, invisibility, and the daily erosion of dignity. And when factories and shops look like paradise in comparison, you finally see the truth. Paradise is relative. So the next time you see a period drama with rows of maids and footmen, remember, by the late Victorian period, families were already complaining they couldn't find staff to keep the illusion alive. The machine was faltering, and the servants, slowly, quietly, stubbornly, were walking away. You've trudged through the attic, scrubbed the coal dust, endured the mistress's suspicion, stitched lace until your eyes blurred, and carried more buckets of water than any one body should. And now, finally, we've reached the end of the story. But here's the twist. The story never really ended. Domestic service didn't simply vanish the moment the Victorians stopped obsessing over white glove inspections. It persisted, reshaped, and seeped quietly into the modern world. By the early 20th century, the great armies of servants had dwindled, yes, but households still needed staff. Only the names changed. The lady's maid became the daily cleaner. The nanny became the au pair. The footman in powdered livery became the chauffeur in a peaked cap. The cook became the part-time housekeeper who still produced meals on demand. The work shifted, modernized, mechanized, but the relationship remained the same. Invisible labor sustaining visible comfort. Think about it. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, dishwashers, all of them are, in their own way, mechanical servants. They replaced the hall boys and scullery maids who once lived in basements, but the expectation behind them hasn't changed. A clean home, polished silver, steaming food, all presented effortlessly, without anyone pausing to think about the sweat behind it. The tools changed, but the invisibility of the labor remained. The irony is that many of us now complain about laundry day or sigh when the dishwasher isn't emptied. Yet a Victorian servant could spend an entire day just scrubbing a single family's linens by hand, from dawn until dusk, arms raw, back bent, never once imagining the hum of a machine doing it for them. The next time you toss laundry in the machine or let a dishwasher hum in the corner, remember, a Victorian servant once spent their whole day doing just that, by hand, in silence. And that silence lingers. Servants' voices rarely appear in history books. The lives of dukes and duchesses, politicians and industrialists, those are recorded in letters, speeches, portraits. The lives of the people who actually kept those households standing are almost invisible. They left behind scraps, an embroidered sampler, a complaint buried in a mistress's diary, a fleeting mention in a census record. Most of what we know about them comes filtered through the eyes of those they served. Mistresses writing endless letters about lazy maids, employers sighing over the servant problem. Their own voices are nearly absent, which is perhaps the greatest injustice of all. The empire they kept running, the houses they kept spotless, the families they raised, all of it rests on their shoulders, and yet they vanish into history without names. You are Mary, or John, or simply the maid, replaceable, forgettable, disposable. But the truth is, they were not forgettable. They were the machine that powered Victorian life. Every glittering ball, every polished table, every neatly dressed gentleman in a cravat, all of it was built on the back of someone down in the scullery, scrubbing until their hands bled. And even today, echoes remain. When you call a cleaner, when you hire a babysitter, when you take a taxi, you are touching the legacy of domestic service. Invisible labor is still everywhere. It just wears different uniforms now. And it is still undervalued, still taken for granted, still too often dismissed as unworthy of recognition. That is the thread that binds the Victorian scullery maid to the modern gig worker. The assumption that this work simply happens, quietly, invisibly, while others live lives of comfort. The names may change, but the dynamic remains hauntingly familiar. So as we draw this journey to a close, let's sit with that thought. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a great Victorian house. Behind the front door, chandeliers glitter, voices laugh, and silk skirts sweep across the floor. But listen harder. In the shadows of the back stairs, in the hiss of the kitchen fire, in the clatter of pans, you'll hear the rhythm that made it all possible. The sound of service, the sound of lives that history was all too happy to overlook. And as you lie here now, warm and comfortable, think about the thousands of unseen hands that once made comfort possible for others while never enjoying it themselves. Think of the hallboy dozing upright, the scullery maid wringing her apron, the footman stiff in his livery. All ghosts now, but not forgotten. Not if we choose to remember. Domestic service didn't decline because it was unnecessary. It declined because people realized they deserved better. And perhaps that's the legacy worth remembering. Endurance, yes, but also resistance. Quiet resistance, one servant at a time, choosing a factory floor over a feather duster, a shop counter over a coal scuttle, dignity over silence. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you push a button and let a machine do the work for you, you'll remember the people who once did it all by hand and wonder how many of their stories are still hidden in the folds of history. So, close your eyes now. The fires are out. The halls are empty. The machines of service have gone quiet. The house stands silent. But you can still hear it, if you listen. The faint echo of footsteps on the servants' stairs, the whisper of water in buckets, the clatter of dishes, the sigh of endless labor. Sleep, knowing you've walked through that world. A world where invisibility was survival, labor was life, and recognition almost never came. A world not so distant as it seems. The day's work is done. The floors have been scrubbed, the grates polished, the endless fires coaxed back to life, and the mistress's white glove has, miraculously, come away clean. The bells are quiet now. The house has gone still, and so have you. Your body is heavy now. The ache of coal, scuttles, buckets, and laundry fades into something softer. The servants of the Victorian household slip back into the shadows of history, leaving only faint echoes behind. But you are in a bed of your own. Your mattress is warm, your pillow forgiving, your rest uninterrupted by the sound of jingling keys or barking orders. The fires are out, the halls are quiet, and you can finally rest. Close your eyes and let the rhythm of that silence settle over you. The staircases are empty. The dining room is dark. No one will call your name or forget it, or replace it with Mary just because it's convenient. For tonight, the burden has been lifted. You've walked through the world of service, and you've stepped out again, whole and unscathed. And if you haven't subscribed, consider it your one small act of rebellion against a world that once wanted servants forgotten. Their stories, their lives, their labor, erased in silence. But you don't have to let silence win. You can keep their memory alive simply by pressing that one button. And as you drift off tonight, remember you can take these stories with you ad-free anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and the pinned comment. So breathe deeply now. Your eyes are closing. The servants fade, the past fades, the house itself fades, brick by brick, until only sleep remains. The fires are out. The halls are quiet, and you can finally rest. And before you drift completely, know this: every subscription, every small act of recognition is a way of saying that you see me, that you see what I do here. If you've subscribed, thank you. You're not just a listener. You're the reason these stories don't vanish into silence, the way the Victorians once vanished their servants. Good night. Sleep well. The work is done.